When it comes to bass fishing, all the thousands of different techniques, you know, you got your spinning gear, you got your top waters, your crankbaits, your jigs and all that. The main thing that stands uniform you always use is line. So when it comes to your different types of line, there's a lot of different options out there. And using the right line makes your baits present a lot more effectively, and you can actually like change the line to make baits do different things. But if you're throwing the wrong type bait on the wrong line, the fish might not bite as well because they can see it, or you might lose them because you can't hook them as well, or the bait just doesn't run right. So using the right pound test and the right type of line, as far as fluorocarbon, braid, all that, those things go, makes a big difference as far as being effective when you're rigging up your rods and fishing tournaments. There's quite a few different types of lines. I'm not talking brands, I'm talking like the way the line is made, what it's made of, so, and how it works. So your types of line is fluorocarbon, which is kind of the most common, everybody probably knows about nowadays. You've got your braided line, which has this great applications, but it is not very see-through, or at all see-through. One that a lot of people don't think of or know of, you've got your fluorocarbon leader line, which is used on a lot of finesse applications. And then you got your monofilament, or in Yozuri's case, the hybrid line. And this is not used as commonly as it used to, but there's still really good applications for monofilament style line. So fluorocarbon line, this Yozuri T7, is probably 80 to 90% of my general fishing applications. I think most tournament anglers now use primarily fluorocarbon line. Back, 15 years ago, we used a lot of monofilament line, but with the advancements in fluorocarbon, it's just better for most things. It's more expensive, obviously, but it presents baits a lot better in certain situations, and it has minimal stretch. So the reason, or the times I use fluorocarbon is pretty much any bait that I'm letting sink and setting the hook with. We're not counting like punching grass, things like that, but let's say your Texas rigs, your jigs, your swim baits that you're getting out there, any of those type baits, fluorocarbon is one of the best lines for that because of the sensitivity, doesn't have much stretch, so you feel everything a lot better. It goes away underwater, it's a lot more see-through than any of your other lines, and it just has a lot of attributes that monofilament and braid just doesn't. And so fluorocarbon, in the early days of fluorocarbon, knot tying was no good with it. You couldn't, the line was strong, but you couldn't get a good knot to hold in it. And with new fluorocarbons, knot strength is great with them. It doesn't have much stretch, so you set the hook good and the knot holds up, and it's just probably the #1 line that I have on 80 to 90% of my rods year round. It's my favorite thing to use on most applications. So when it comes to the different baits, when you're using like crankbaits and things like that, you want to vary your line size depending on how deep you want your crankbait to go. I would say 10 to 12 pound fluorocarbon is my go-to cranking, but if you want your crankbait, it's not like a uniform 1 pound test you always use. If I want my square bill crankbait to not go that deep, I'm throwing it shallow, I want it to come through grass, I want to maybe not get down to the bottom, just hit wood. You can go up to 20 pound test if you need to, so you can vary your line size to make that bait act differently. Same goes with jerk baits. Anything with a bill, lighter you go, the deeper it goes, the heavier you go, the shallower it runs. Lipless, same thing, same concept. But generally when you're setting the hook fishing, worm fishing, I very rarely go heavier than 12 pound test. With jigs, worms, swim baits, things I set the hook with, I go 12 to 25 pound test depending on how heavy a cover I'm throwing it around. But fluorocarbon, #1 line you're gonna use most common. Next, you got your braided line. This is Yozuri Super Braid, what I use most time. This is yellow, I don't use yellow a ton. I like the green braided lines, but braided line always has its place in fishing. So most topwaters, I throw in braided line. You'll have people tell you different things. Some people love mono, some people don't. I like braided line just because I can spool a reel at the start of topwater season, and I can use that line most of the year. Cast good, cast far, and you've got minimal stretch with the braided line, but you can see it. So it's really good topwater line. Frog, you know, any type of walking bait topwater. It's really good for it, but visibility obviously is basically 100%. It's string is what it is. So it's really, really good too, this braided line. If you're not doing it, I think majority of people probably are now, but braided line is great on spinning rods. 15 is the maximum I ever put on my spinning gear because it casts a lot better, the lighter braids. I'll go down to 10. 10's my go-to on all spinning gear. And the green super braid makes spinning gear worlds better than it used to be before we had good braided lines. But braid has its applications. I always leave a few rods rigged with it for top waters, and then all my spinning gear is always rigged with braided fishing line. So the kind of lost category of line that a lot of people don't use anymore is your monofilament line. This is Yo-Zuri hybrid line. It's kind of the equivalent of monofilament line. It's actually, you know, fluorocarbon coated nylon line, but it's essentially like monofilament line. So monofilament, it's not used very often anymore, and I'm not gonna lie, I don't use it a ton, but there's certain applications when you really can benefit from monofilament line. Number one, top waters are good on monofilament line because it floats. And it has a little stretch to it, which sounds bad, but sometimes with top waters, if the fish aren't getting the bait well or you're pulling hooks out of them, that monofilament can be really, really good for that. And like a wake bait, it'll keep a wake bait up really, really well if you throw monofilament line because it does float. And there's one application that I use monofilament line often that, depending on where you are in the country, you may have not thought about or really even had to do, is sometimes in very, very cold, you know, February, as cold as it gets in the South where I am, you know, sub-freezing, 20 degree, 15 degree cranking days in the winter, you can actually swap your fluorocarbon to monofilament line, cast a lot better. You don't have quite that sensitivity, but the cold makes fluorocarbon very, very stiff. And monofilament line doesn't get near as stiff in that cold weather. So I'll actually crank some finesse crankbaits, you know, in the wintertime, early spring with monofilament line. Still got its place, but I will say it's not used near as often as it used to be. So one last line category that I think a lot of bass fishermen don't even realize about, and I'm not gonna lie, I didn't even know about it until I partnered with Yo-Zuri and started using a lot of their lines, is fluorocarbon leader. In the saltwater world, everybody uses fluorocarbon leader, not just fluorocarbon for their leader line on their, you know, spinning gear, things like that, where you tie a fluorocarbon leader to braid. Up till 5 years ago, I used just mainline, you know, like your T7, just your spool of fluorocarbon is what I used as my leader line on my spinning gear. Well, last few years, I've switched to true 100% fluorocarbon leader, and it's worlds better for spinning gear because it ties better knots. It's a little stiffer, which is actually good as a leader, but you wouldn't be able to spool a whole rod with it. And that stiffness and, you know, good abrasion resistance, you can't get on a good subtle line that you spool the whole reel with. But it's fine when you're using a 6, 8, 10-foot leader. So everything that you that you need, that extra abrasion resistance, maybe that extra stiffness that you don't want in casting line, makes the perfect leader line. So I switched and started using true leader, and this is Yo-Zuri Super Fluoro Leader. There's a lot of different fluoro leaders out there, but I highly recommend on spinning gear especially, you try true fluorocarbon leader. Don't just use a fluorocarbon main line as that leader. Your line is the most important aspect of fishing. I mean, it's your connection from your bait, from that fish, that 9-pounder, to your rod. So using the right line makes your baits work better, gets that fish to bite, and helps you get them in the boat. So those tips, hopefully it'll help you use the right line for the right presentations.